Okay, should we start? And I can start giving an introduction, I guess, while people are coming into the room.
Yeah, go for it.
All right, good evening, welcome. Welcome to the first event of our first project conversation series organized by the American Institute of Architects in Hong Kong. My name is Su Chang and I am co-chairing the programs committee of AIA Hong Kong this year. First project is a new initiative of AIA Hong Kong, for which we invite architects from Hong Kong, the US, and the Asia Pacific region to reflect upon how their practice started and how their beginning led to the architectural adventures they are in now. And our speakers tonight, Paul Zhe and Evelyn Ting, both from Hong Kong, began their study of architecture overseas, work in cities around the world, get licensed and became members of the AIA, and chose to return and start their practice here in Hong Kong. Their design office, New Office Works, now, was named by Art Daily as one of the best young practices of 2020. They were also the first prize winner in the inaugural Hong Kong Young Architects and Designers competition. Paul and Evelyn also involved in teaching at CUHK and HKU. So this evening, we will take the format of a conversation. After their presentation, Evelyn and Paul will be joined by Winston Yu, founder and director of OFGA, and the 2021 president of AIA Hong Kong. We would love to invite all of our audience to submit your questions or topics you would like to discuss through Q&A or chat box on Zoom. All right, so Evelyn and Paul, welcome, and please start anytime when you're ready.
Great. Thanks, Chang, for the introduction.
Thank you.
Yeah, and thanks to AIHK for inviting us. We're really excited to be part of this new first project series and share a bit about our experience so far in starting up the firm. So let me share our screen. Yeah, so as Chang mentioned, both Paul and I are from Hong Kong, and it's been a big influence on us in terms of the architectural work that we do, and as an architecture office based in Hong Kong. There's a lot of binaries and juxtapositions in the urban landscape that we find very exciting and has a lot of influence on the architecture projects that we do. This is Robert Venturi's Fauna House, and it's maybe typical of a first project that you would get in North America or Europe, but of course in the Hong Kong context it's vastly different, and we're constantly dealing with very large scale buildings and a clash of different programs in the same building. Personally, my approach into architecture is there's two approaches that I was initially interested in. First, writing is a big interest of mine, and I've always been interested in architectural writing and kind of thinking about the discipline from writing and history, which is a big part of our approach to architecture in the office. And at the same time, when I went back to do my master's at MIT, I was also interested in the kind of the making side of it, so being involved in constructing, fabricating, and working with materials. So for me, the kind of writing or narrative element and the construction element are both very exciting for architecture.
And also just some very brief background of myself too. So I did my first master in Melbourne, Australia. So slightly different than the context that Evelyn was trained, which she went to Columbia in New York. So in Melbourne, it was the architectural scene was actually quite different than let's say North America or Europe. And I guess because of the sort of distance or the remoteness of Australia, they sort of have their own vernacular and architectural languages. And actually, one of the key architects that was influencing the Melbourne scene was Peter Corrigan. And you can actually see a lot of people coming out of the school that I went to, which was RMIT. They kind of have very idiosyncratic design methodology, and they also always kind of emphasize on like, you know, geometry and bright colors. And as a student, that always a little bit bothering me that, you know, why there was such an approach in the architectural scene in Melbourne. And this is a building by the architect that I mentioned just now, Peter Corrigan, and this is the architectural department of RMIT is located. And you can see there is a lot of expressionism and also geometric and almost theatrical. So at first, you know, obviously as a young student, I had no idea where all these were from. Also being from Hong Kong, like that's also quite foreign. And then, but you know, later on, I actually found out that, like, you know, because Peter Corrigan actually went to Yale and studied under Robert Venturi, and then the sort of rebellious against the typical classic modernism attitude was then eventually brought back to Melbourne. And then similar to Venturi, like he was also searching for local vernacular and design references and languages that he found appropriate to the local context. So I think that was kind of one of the early influence, kind of learning from, you know, the education under this sort of direction. And right after school, that was actually right at 2008, when the rest of the world was in recession. But then there was this whole new world of excitement in Beijing. And both Evelyn and I, back then we didn't know each other, but that's actually what drawn us to the same place, the sort of whole optimism and excitement of the post-Olympic Beijing. So that's kind of where we eventually met each other. So in the background of this magnificent, spectacular architecture, we were actually living in hutongs and experiencing the more sort of less flamboyant, let's say, side of Beijing. But then at work, we were also obviously doing some pretty exuberant architecture. And one of the projects that I worked on was the Harbin Opera House when I was at Mad Architects. And I don't take credit of the you know, the full form. That was Ma and some other Maya experts. But I was kind of responsible to really understand and to look into the working of an opera house. So I was like spending a lot of time researching and developing the plans and sections. And then after MAD, I also did my master in Columbia, and I also encountered different ideologies. And one of the more sort of impactful experience was also meeting Kirsten Gears right after I graduated. And then I also taught with him for a semester. And that was in 2011, almost 10 years ago, when the whole architectural world was full of parametricism and really photorealistic renderings. And then Kirsten Gears, who is a Belgian architect, he was actually advocating like not using 3D mod as a modeling tool, and then not doing renderings and be very sort of collagey and almost to an extreme of conservatism, but against the backdrop of what was happening, that was actually very refreshing. So by having the experience of like doing really fluid and organic architecture, but then also experiencing the complete opposite during my time in New York, gave us an insight of like how we might actually respond to the time and how we can actually find our own voice. So after work, we would actually crash back to Columbia to school and find empty classrooms to do competition. And because of the experience that I gained from working on Opera House, one of the first competition that we did was the Busan Opera House. So the brief asked for obviously a new opera house for Busan that was going to build on an island next to a new artificial island that they are going to have commercial and residential program, which was actually quite similar to the Harbin Opera House because that was also built on an artificial island. And then we were kind of thinking, instead of building on an artificial island, what if the opera house itself is an island? So that's kind of the first concept was from. So then we created this square island where the opera house is in. And from the sort of top level, which is basically like a urban plaza that has this objects that are protruding to that square plinth. And in the middle of that plinth, there will be obviously the theater, the flying tower, and the backup house, and so on. And as people would filter through the performance and events, they would then, after viewing the performances, they will then arrive at the water level and then eventually leave the opera house. So this idea of filtering and being filtrated by the performance was also another key ideas for this project. And the opera house would also take form again like an island, but so during the day you have this silhouette of almost like the skyline floating above an island, but then at night the island itself became the obstacle, the spectacle.
And at the same time, we were doing lots of competitions. So some, as Paul mentioned, at the opera house scale are very large, but at the same time, we were also working on much smaller scale competitions. So this is a competition we did for a pavilion in the Socrates Sculpture Park in Queens, New York. And we were interested in stripping back to very basic architectural elements such as the roof, the wall, columns, and arches. These are some model photos. So even from the very beginning, we're very interested in studying and developing architectural projects through model making as well. And here you can see, in addition to looking at the elements of the column or the roof, we were also interested in how, condensed in a very small architectural object, how do we use binaries or opposite elements to enhance the experience within a relatively small footprint. So you can see the transition between a small intimate scale to the large scale with the sloping of the roof, a repetition of smaller openings to larger openings. So trying to use this juxtaposition of opposite conditions in a quite condensed space in order to create a certain experience or architectural atmosphere. And again, the visual experience of the repetition of different elements was of great interest to us. And so we arrive at now, and both, as Chang mentioned in his introduction, we moved back to Hong Kong in 2017. This is where we initially started off, a very small space, a kind of hole in the wall space above a clothing shop. And you can see we combined all of the laptops that we had to try to do competitions and small projects that we had at the very beginning. And at the same time, we were constantly asking ourselves how to define ourselves as a practice. And we were interested in looking at the cities, and we found a lot of interesting comparisons and parallels between LA and Hong Kong. Both are, in terms of landscape, very different. In LA, it's very much about the horizontal, and in Hong Kong, about the vertical, but they share a similar sense of interest in signage and very intense kind of consumerist experience, and we thought that there were a lot of parallels between the two cities. And again, I think even though they have very sharp differences between the two cities, they share a very strong sense of imagery between the two. So on the left-hand side is a painting by Ed Richey, and on the right-hand side is a snapshot of a Hong Kong film. And in addition, one of the artists that has had a big influence on us is Ed Richey. This is one of his seminal projects, Every Building on the Sunset Strip, which compares the changing landscape of buildings on the Sunset Strip between 1960s and I think 30 or 40 years down the road. And it's a very, first of all, a way of documenting the changing landscape. And we also liked the kind of side-by-side comparison, a way of doing site research or looking at the city. And that brings us to one of our very first projects of the office, which is Middleman, Hong Kong. It is a research series of 12 episodes looking at different aspects of Hong Kong. And they range from episodes of Middleman, looking at different characters, palm trees as well. And very thankfully, we had the support of one of the local organizations, Design Trust, in Hong Kong to support this video series. And so that was really one of the starting points for us as an office. And also, in addition to looking at the video series, trying to use film as a different way of looking at the city. So typically in architecture, we study the city through drawings, through images, through writing, and we wanted to explore film as a new medium. And just to go in slightly more in depth into some of the episodes, episode 4 was on palm tree, and one of the interests was looking at all the different places in Hong Kong where you do see the palm tree. It varies in different contexts from the very urban, dense environment. Oftentimes you see them right in the middle of the street, a busy street. But at the same time, there's a weird juxtaposition between the palm tree being a symbol of relaxation. So we thought that that was a very Hong Kong element to us. The shortcuts, because of Hong Kong's hilly terrain, there are oftentimes different elevator cores or staircases that appear in the city, and they have a very strong physical presence. And in a sense, they're kind of like small architecture pieces that you find throughout the city, and they all have their own different sense of material. And so that was also a kind of a gem that we found in the city as well. And then we also have escalators, which typically you find within buildings, but in Hong Kong, it really is a bridge between the interior and exterior, and oftentimes they cross out into the surface of facades. You see them not only in the dense city streets, but also in relatively natural environments. So that was also something that is very characteristic of Hong Kong, we felt. And I just want to play you a short clip so you get a sense of one of the videos. Again, this is the underbelly of the HSBC building. And partly the video is really a documentation of, or a kind of visual catalog of different escalators. But at the same time, particularly with the videos, what we wanted to do was also bring in bits of historical elements. So, you know, the very first escalators in Hong Kong, how they appear in different scales and different contexts. On the facade of buildings, as I was mentioning earlier, and it's very integrated into malls, but also markets, and of course the very well-known long escalator in Central. This is writer Liu Yichang, who also has a book called Tet Besh, which is talking about two characters that go through the city, and they kind of have parallel experiences between a man and a woman. And at one point in the story, in the theater, is where they meet, and then they kind of their paths diverge again. And so this again is also very related to Escalators, where oftentimes you have them moving in two different directions, and is also a very cinematic way of looking at the city. And of course, Wong Kar-wai's Chungking Express, which is looking at escalators in Central and a very important part of Hong Kong cinema.
So with the research that we have been doing, well, partly because of our interest, sort of looking at Hong Kong, like, which is a place where we grew up, but also through a lens that we sort of, when we first came back, we didn't have a lot of work, and then we want to also really look at the city and document the city almost with a fresh eye. So that was one of the main reason or intention that drives us to do those 12 films. And then while we were working on those films, we also had a couple of small projects, and one of these, another project is called Studio with a Core. So it's actually a bare shell apartment in Haikou. So it is an apartment about 600 square feet in footprint, but then it has a relatively tall ceiling space, about 6 meters. And it overlooks a very lush green golf course. So those were the kind of initial elements that we were working with. And we wanted to think about how can we actually, because we really wanted to do architecture, but in an interior. So that was one of the questions that we kept asking ourselves: how can we actually do an interior design project but still introduce this idea of architecture? So we initially thought we could create almost like 6 or 7 little tiny buildings in this duplex apartment. So they would contain bathroom, kitchen, or like bedrooms or reading areas and so on and so forth. And these were the early collages that we were envisioning. So we because of the golf course, obviously we wanted to maximize the views to the exterior, but then at the same time we almost wanted to bring in the garden or the balcony into the interior. So there's almost no separation between what's outside and what's inside. And while you are taking a bath, like, you can actually view directly out to the golf course. And then we also then asked ourselves, with all the projects or all the films that we were working on with Middleman, we were thinking, how can we actually start to incorporate urban elements, almost like, you know, one of these standalone core, elevator core and stairs in Hong Kong. So we then eventually shifted the project, and we changed slightly. So by introducing a stair that almost acts as a piece of infrastructure for this tiny apartment. So as soon as you walk in from the door, all you would see is a stair and within a dark room. And eventually, if you go outside, then you start to open up and immerse yourself in a garden. The apartment is also slightly flipped in a sense that the bedroom was at the lower floor because the client wanted to sleep inside the garden. And then eventually the kitchen and the living room would then be on the above floor. So this is a physical model. Again, there's an existing balcony area. So what we did was try to extend the balcony through and then blend it into the interior. We are introducing also a 5-meter tall sliding door, so it could be completely slide open. So in order to further connect the inside and outside. And this is an image when you first enter the main door. So we have this cast in place concrete wall with a spiral stair leading you up. But then, of course, like once you go behind the door, it will be much more brighter and open. And the core almost again, signifies its presence by having this really strong presence of verticality and solidity. And once the sliding door is open, then the garden is basically an extension of the balcony. And on the above floor, you have like a view of the stair, but also there's like a glimpse of the outside as well. And then there are some living spaces on the above floor. And the project is currently under construction, should be done soon, hopefully. And then another early project that we worked on is called Human Library. It is actually an Art Basel booth for the M+ Museum in 2019. So when we were approached by the M+ Museum, they told us that this year, instead of showing art pieces or like the or like prints or information like they usually had, they would this time want to introduce their staff as the exhibit or exhibited objects. So the staff from M+ Museum would almost become what they call a human library or an art object, and then to sort of introduce what they are actually doing and at M+ Museum. So the site is actually quite tight. It's only 8 meters by 4.5 meters, and it has this quite a strange shape. And so we were thinking about, okay, we have this brief, and with such a small space, it's a very ambitious idea to create a library in such a small space. And this is what you usually get within an art fair, basically cubicles of walls and paintings and art pieces on the hung on the wall. And we also were thinking about, okay, if the person is an art piece, obviously you have performance artists who basically became the object itself. And usually they are sort of sit inside a frame to signify that they are the art pieces. But then because of the limited space, we need to come up with other ways to frame the objects, or in this case, the people, with minimal means. So this is kind of references of Franco Albini, like how he basically just used posts to hand painting rather than use wall, and by introducing like lighting and other devices to really frame the art pieces in different ways. So then eventually we arrived at this idea of using series of furniture where people will be sitting, and then by using this sort of headlight to create almost a frame. So while you have a clusters of this furniture and chairs, it will start to almost create a frame, a framing device. So we went through some like mock-ups and tests and trials, ensuring at the factory that these chairs are steady, because the light post is actually 2 meters tall. So there were quite a bit of concern from the museum that whether or not that will be safe, especially when people are standing and moving around it. But it turns out pretty safe. So within such a small footprint, we were asked to have about 12 people simultaneously and have dialogues and so on. And then we also were asked to provide like back of house, and we also had this idea of question wall. So the idea is each of these clusters would have a staff from the museum, and then the other 3 will be the visitors. And what they would do is that they will come to the question wall and pick up a question which are either prescribed, or the visitors can also write the question themselves. And once they take that piece of question, which is in a card format, they will put it on the question stand, and so that the passerby can understand what the discussion is about. So, so these are the final furniture. Obviously, that's the chair with the lamppost, and then the question stand. And then this is the question wall. So a lot of people were very actively asking questions and writing down the questions. So in a sense, like, you know, the library also became not just a place where people absorb, but for the museum to also create a dialogue as well. So the chairs could be arranged in different way, and they will have different appearance. And this is what it happens when, you know, when there's no one sitting. Almost looks like as if the chairs are already talking amongst themselves. And this is when visitors are learning about the museum. So aside from sort of smaller installation projects, we usually are also quite actively in larger competitions. So this is a competition for the Vilnius National Concert Hall. So the site is at a mountain. Currently, there's like an old building that the city would like to demolish. So when we were first looking at the site, we look at the sort of larger urban context, and we realized there's quite a strong axial relationship to the surrounding. So there's a over 100 years old bank at the bottom of the mountain, and then there's also a large urban city square, and there's actually a cemetery in the back of the site. So we wanted to really emphasize this axis by our proposal. So then we, instead of putting something right in the middle of this axis, we actually wanted to emphasize the void space along this axis. So this diagram shows that how we are also placing an amphitheater in the middle of the park, and also eventually creating this urban piazza in between the theaters. So this is a section cutting through the mountain. That's the bank that I just mentioned. So really the whole experience is very focusing and emphasizing on this axial dimension. And this is the main theater. So the brief asked for a large theater that could fit about 1,500 people, and then a smaller theater for 500 people. And then there should also be a component of cultural facilities for the residents there. So in a sense, we created almost like two separate buildings that has this plaza that can be shared by people. And so this is that, again, that void space along the axis, and the main theater on the right-hand side, and then the culture and cultural facilities, as well as the smaller theater on the left-hand side, with parking and arrival at the bottom. So the idea was actually to think about splitting a single footprint of a concert hall into two buildings that start to create dialogues and that urban plaza in the middle. And also we are also creating different terraces and also viewing platforms for people, because the site is right at the mountain. So we wanted to maximize people's visibility to the rest of the city. So this is the physical model. And a couple of views from different points. So this is when you are standing down at the park near the amphitheater that we first introduced. And from that, you can actually walk all the way up to that plaza. And in a sense, that void, because of the contrast of material, which we use a lighter material on the outside, and then a more sort of solid stone on the inside. So in a sense, that cut almost naturally signified the arrival moment. And because of the U-channel glass that we are proposing on the skin, because obviously in the winter, the snowscape will have a really strong relationship to the sort of light material of the facade. And this is at the grand step coming up. And then the sort of void space that leads you down to the parking. So when you when visitors arrive via car, they would park their car and then they will come up this stair, and then as soon as they come up the stair, they will have this view framed by the building. And some interior shots. So we also spend quite a bit of time developing the facade system, which is consists of this curved scallops that would at certain moments reveal the interior with gaps in between them. And the play of like light and shadow was also a big part of this facade studies. So this is when you are sort of standing at the plaza looking at the facade of the building. So different pockets would reveal themselves, and as if they were kind of balconies inside the performance at the concert hall. And then this is the project that we did in 2017, which was a competition hosted by the West Kowloon Cultural District. They wanted to give an opportunity for young architects in Hong Kong to build a small pavilion structure. So the site is in between a nursery park, which is where the West Kowloon district plant their trees. And then there's this waterfront promenade on the other side. So the site in a sense is in between of these two conditions. So an aerial view, you can kind of see like all the office buildings, office towers in the back, and plus museum is over there. And for those who don't know, West Kowloon is one of the largest cultural districts in the making in Hong Kong. It's actually been going on for probably almost 20 years. So it has been a very politically and culturally charged site. So there are a lot of like museums and performance centers, etc., to be built in this space. So when we were first approached in such a daunting task, even though it's a relatively small building in comparison to all the museums, but you know, to us it still represents a very important space in Hong Kong's architecture. So we wanted to already introduce what we usually find in Hong Kong. So this is actually, I don't think we ever really shown this before, but this is actually one of the very, very first ideas that we had, which consists of, even though it doesn't look anything like the pavilion now, but it already has certain ideas that we wanted to introduce, such as, for one, we always wanted to show that the obstruction is such a big part of Hong Kong. Like everywhere you go, you are somewhat being obstructed, either visually or physically, like, you know, usually by signs or by whatnot. And then we also wanted to have some kind of lightweight roof structure. And there should be also some steps for people to sit and with like a higher point of view, and then some kind of viewing device to direct people's view towards the promenade, the waterfront promenade. So obviously the idea sort of got evolved, and then we like play around with different roofscapes you know, also trying to create some kind of light frame structure with still the idea that maybe the back of the pavilion will still be denser so that it will somewhat obscure the view. And then eventually we like thought, okay, maybe then the roof should be something rather heavy, and then like with some really lightweight columns supporting it, and then with some kind of landscape or seating that will allow people to almost, you know, experience the topography in Hong Kong. So while thinking about all this, we also were looking back to the site about the nursery park and this idea of planting trees. And that kind of gave us the idea of how growing as an idea is really important to our project, both in the sense that the trees are being grown, and also West Kowloon being a cultural district that is still growing. So all this sort of became some of the main principles and ideas. And eventually we kind of arrived at our final scheme, which has a series of increasing height columns that in a sense gave the slanted roof shape. And then we obviously had the stepping like we discussed before, and the tunnel that kind of guides people's circulation and view. And the pavilion should also look rather different from every angle. So from this angle, it looks rather quite a lot of trellis and structure. And on the other side is kind of this transparent roof. And then even in the, like we also, another thing that we just really enjoy doing is like really think about like the making of architecture too, like even the drawings and how we actually represent ideas. So these drawings try to indicate like how the sort of the trees are almost like echoing our columns, and then the open space that relates to the promenade space there. And everything is very modularized. I think that's one of the reasons why we were also selected, because of the buildability. And like mentioned before, the idea of growing has also been something that we feel really strongly that we need to embed in the idea in the pavilion. So we identify 6 elements that we usually find in Hong Kong. So one of them is the narrow corridors, narrow alleys. And then everywhere you go, obviously scaffolding is right in front of you. So the density, the visual density was something that we also wanted to introduce. And the mountainous topography, landscape being also part of everyday's life, going up and down the steps. And traditional roofs that, you know, taking wisdom from how it shed water and protect from wind and so on and sun. But then we wanted to also introduce a new way of interpreting the traditional roof. So by, instead of using heavy and solid material, we wanted to try and use light and transparent materials. And like our Middleman series, palm tree is one of our little obsessions. So because they are always being juxtaposed at, you know, the most busy street, while, you know, they are suggesting calm and relaxation. So that's something that we found really fascinating and representative of Hong Kong. And rain, because when we were designing this, it was in the summer. So it was raining the whole time because Hong Kong has really heavy rains in the summer. So we wanted to also incorporate how rain would actually perceive at the pavilion. So all these kind of 6 characters made up different parts of and fragments of the pavilion. And in terms of the usage and programmatic function, it can obviously provide a performance and flexible event space, such as maybe a screening, or they also have like dance performances or like jazz festival. but really to us, on a daily basis, the pavilion is almost a framing device of the sunset. So the pavilion was actually done completely, almost built in a factory in China. The wood is C40 pine from Europe, and then they were shipped to China, and then everything was assembled correctly already in the factory before it moved on to the site. So the fabrication maybe took about 2 months, and on-site work took only about 3 weeks because everything was already tested out, and all they had to do is like put things in place on site. And when we were kind of thinking about the roof and all the pieces, we wanted to kind of play with the scale so that they are much bigger than the traditional counterpart, but then at the same time, they are small enough for 1 or 2 workers to handle. So this is the complete pavilion. As you can see, the nursery part again on the left. So when we were thinking about people's approach, they were mostly coming from the nursery part, and they would kind of go through the tunnel and eventually open up to the larger 10-meter height space on the other side. So the pavilion again will look rather different from every angle. So this one you see like the transparency of the roof and reflectiveness almost echoing to the water in the front. And then on the other side is like mostly wood that you see, and the columns became almost like a backdrop for the lawn area where people usually have picnics. And then this is the part where we wanted to almost somewhat obscuring the harbor front ahead, and then the only place that you should go is the tunnel, which you will then eventually walk through. On the other side, again, you will open up to a larger open space. And because of the transparent roof and the relationship to the structure, the light and shadow throughout the day plays also a large role at the actual pavilion. And we spend quite a lot of time making sure that the details are making sense and also easy to build. And this is inside during sunset, looking at the sunset through the frame of the pavilion. And at night, it takes on a completely different appearance because usually the underside of the steps are the darkest, but then at night, we wanted to brighten and make that part the brightest. So we have a small clips again to just show
the character of the pavilion. And I think in the context of first projects or also thinking about architecture practices, I think one thing that there are clear parallels between the idea or design of the pavilion, our research in Middleman, Hong Kong, and even the early competitions of different pavilions that we did before establishing now. And I think one of the takeaways of setting up a practice, sometimes the ideas can collide naturally, but it's also using projects to build up certain ideas, whether they're competitions or commissioned work, or even projects of different scales. I think what we try to do is really not look at projects so much in isolation, but see them as a way to build up certain interests of ours as a practice in architectural themes, certain vocabularies, things we're interested in doing with architectural elements such as the roof. In the early pavilion competition, I had shown in the one in Socrates Park, it was has a lot of similar elements with the West Kowloon Pavilion, for example, the juxtaposition of the two scales or the presence of the roof. And so for us as a practice, I think growing the practice is really about, I think, returning to a constant set of ideas and trying to develop them in more detail, develop them through different scales and also different materials as well. Yeah,
so I think, to to pick up on Evelyn's note, I also think that like because the daily works are you know, could be very overwhelming, and sometimes like I think it really takes like a conscious decision to really think of what is it that we are pursuing, and like how can we sort of also be critical about what we have done, and but at the same time like really try and not be too sort of lost in the day-to-day production or like the sort of work. So yeah, I think and I think, you know, whenever we were sort of asked to give a talk, I think that usually is a good place for us to really also reflect on like what has the work been evolving, and how we can actually you know, learn from what we have done, and how we can then take that to the next step. So yeah, I think that's pretty much our presentation, and hopefully we will have a good discussion after this. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the very wonderful presentation. We have received many comments and questions. Maybe we can, Winston, maybe we can join, and maybe we can start with some of the questions and comments.
Sure, thanks, Suzhang. Thanks, Evelyn. Thanks, Paul. That was a beautiful presentation. We had received some questions in the beginning, so I can just jump right into them. Now, and for all the audiences, I'm sure after seeing Evelyn and Paul's presentation, you might have some other questions. Feel free to add them to the chat, and we'll pick them up as we go. So this is not in any order, but in the order that they were received in. When and why did you decide to move back to Hong Kong?
Well, we moved back in beginning of 2017. I think we were at a stage, previously we were both working in London, and I think we were at a stage in our career where we felt that we wanted to test out starting our own practice, and we felt that Hong Kong was both of us are from Hong Kong, so we felt that it was a good home base for our first architecture venture, and also as we had shown through the various projects, I think it's very, of course, a very dense urban environment, but I think also brings with it a lot of exciting challenges for architecture, thinking about architectural vocabulary in different ways and how to build in a very intense environment, but also try and keep a certain sense of autonomy to our architectural work. So that's kind of the when and why.
Yeah. Maybe there was also, I think there's also an underlying question that was it really say a conscious decision, or was it just an impulse, or is there anything that really drive you to feel that it's time?
It was a conscious decision. You know, there's obviously, I think both of us have learned a lot from working at different kinds of offices. Paul has worked at many kind of design offices. In London was working for a smaller office working on residential projects, but really hands-on work. And so we were excited we wanted to bring both of our slightly varied work experience into an office together.
Yeah, and I also think definitely the impulse has always been there. I guess like it's just whether you you really feel like, you know, at a certain point you just couldn't hold it any longer. And I think also there are like kind of personal reasons, like, you know, to move back. And when we sort of first, even before we moved back, we were sort of thinking, okay, like we have always wanted to try it out. And maybe we should just take this chance moving back home as like a, you know, as like a step so that we can really force ourselves to take it. Rather than like, you know, already move back and then find a job, and, you know, you would then, you know, naturally sort of fit into the system. So like, and, you know, we thought, okay, maybe we'll give it a try. And that was kind of also because of the moving and relocating also sort of facilitate the initiation of the practice.
And you also participated in a lot of competitions. But competitions in Hong Kong, especially for young architects, they don't necessarily lead to a commission of a project. So do you have any advice for many of the young architects or fresh graduate in the audience, like how if they should participate or how should they participate in these competitions?
Yeah, I think everyone who's been in the field for a long time and new students know that competition is a very grueling process. A lot of, I would say, the majority of firms have gone through the kind of, or are regularly involved in doing competitions, obviously at various scales, but it feels like a integral part of practicing architecture. I think it's a very good way of kind of doing research in a sense. It's kind of like, we think of it as R&D for architecture offices to test out different ideas in different scenarios that are given by competition briefs. I would say you never can tell whether a competition whether a competition entry is going to be successful or not. It's just impossible to say. But I think that going into or developing work for a competition, it's one of our biggest takeaways is to try and hone in on the concept, or try to find how our concept can respond to the brief in a slightly different way than maybe other competitors. And I think it's a good way to not only within the competition to try and make your design stand out, but also it helps to, as a practice, to try and clarify what you want to offer as a design, as an architecture practice, and how is your philosophy or approach to architecture going to be different than, say, other firms. And how do you communicate the way you communicate certain ideas, so methods of representation, how you do design, different tools that you use, and all of that has a big impact on the resultant project. And I think the competition is kind of a expedited process to explore or clarify those aims.
And also because Hong Kong, or I think Asia in general, maybe we don't really have like the European competition system. So it's actually rather, I think, difficult for like young practices to really have those chances. For example, if in Europe, like there are like already quite some established ways where young architects still have chances to win commissions. So in a sense, I think that has always been one of the hurdles or like concerns that, if we were to move back here, it probably will still be quite difficult if we wanted to like keep on like hitting on competition and like relentlessly, but whether something is worth doing. I think eventually, like in the beginning it's like whatever, right? Like you're young and you have a lot of time, and you just want to do something fun, and you will just do whatever. But then like after a certain amount of years, then you really would start to consider like what is worthwhile doing. And but yeah, of course, like at the end of the day, you can't really like presume or like even guess like how you might have a better chance. But I think, yeah, it's just like kind of, I think choosing competition wisely, and then, and then forget about like, whether you are going to win or not, but, just trying to really execute your voice and ideas.
I think your practice has really brought out an important point. I mean, from the perspective of a lot of younger architects, they look at these things as, a lot of time and maybe not necessarily paid. So from a survival standpoint, it's very hard to take on a lot of competitions. But as you've shown in your practices, the competition is really competitions or other just your film series. I think that's a really great example where you can begin to hone in on your interest and your skills and your curiosities as a practice. Okay, let's read one from the audience just coming in now. Okay, so the first one came in from an anonymous attendee. Let me know if I've misinterpreted the question, but I believe it's asking whether or not you have a whether or not the movie series or academic or other media methods were meant to gain exposure and lead into new projects and expand your career when you did them initially. So for example, say the Middleman project. You mentioned it was that with Design Trust?
Yeah, it was. Yeah, it was.
Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, it's funded by Design Trust. They are a nonprofit organization based in Hong Kong that funds different kinds of, not just architecture, but different design-related initiatives. And so we applied to them with this idea of doing a film series. And as I mentioned during the presentation, it was really, we had just moved back from London, and even though both of us are from here, at the same time, we felt that the environment was, at the same, there was a sense of unfamiliarity with the environment as well. And so for us, the film series was a way of kind of relearning our environment in a way. And also looking at, let's say, very small details in the urban environment that we, just from living here so long, you kind of overlook. And you're not really looking at it from an architectural point of view. And so that's how the series came about. And alongside, we were also doing competition. So I think there was a lot of natural crossovers between, I think, doing research and doing and producing design works. Yeah, for us, observing the built environment and is a source of a lot of inspiration for.
What is that ratio? I mean, how much time does your office spend on doing research-based work versus commercial work that pays for the light, keeps the light on?
Well, I think
in the beginning,
definitely, like almost 100% was research in the beginning, and like to answer the question before, like basically that I don't think Middleman need to anything. Even we had like a slight hope, yeah, maybe people can hire us to make videos, but no, people,
totally different field.
yeah. So no, I think, and obviously that was more sort of for ourselves really, to just to like, you know, see architecture as like part of the kind of so-called cultural production, like, you know, just how you can, you know, as through what our understanding with architecture, in a sense, to produce something that maybe like outside architecture's realm, people would still be interested. That was the first hope. And also to just kind of slightly talk a little bit more about why we make it, also because like we realize a lot of let's say foreign artists or people who produce videos, a lot of them actually very fascinated with Hong Kong. Like, you know, whenever you see future cities or future slum, mostly it would be depicted as Hong Kong, right? So in a sense, we also wanted to not so much like glorify Hong Kong as a city, but we also just simply wanted to show it as it is. Like, we don't want to show it as a dystopian. We wanted to show it as like a place where, you know, 7.5 million people live, and how actually like different elements have their own intelligence and so on and so forth. So yeah, it was also kind of maybe like that's kind of slight ambitious thing, but you know, at least to ourselves, that was one of the main meanings of making those videos.
There are also a lot of questions related to the, you know, the practice, the business side of the practice. So, for example, there are questions that relates to how you balance between competitions and develop new business with clients, how to attract new clients and develop, you know, new project opportunities. And especially now it's COVID, you know, all under COVID. Do you have any reflection on that, any thoughts about that?
Yeah.
I mean, I think in terms of, maybe this is a bit naive, but we still feel strongly that in order to attract and work with good clients, it's all about building up a really strong portfolio. So still, it's very much about the work rather than other things that practices might be able to do to attract clients. So, and I think in that sense, competitions and doing our own research, helping to strengthen our identity as an office, and also building up good work. I think all of those really help to attract clients. And for us, I think so far it has, to a certain extent. I mean, of course, it's not going to come, maybe there's a certain amount of patience that's involved with slowly building up portfolio, built works, and trying to kind of build up your identity as a practice. But I think ultimately, at the end of the day, it's really about design works that we feel strongly about, and having a solid portfolio of those in order to explain to a client that this is how we approach design. Because it's not, on one hand, I think as a young practice, for young practices starting out, of course, the hope is to get commissioned work and get clients. But at the same time, in order to really sustain yourself more, sustain the office long term, it's also about working with good clients that understand your design methodology, that you kind of
but there are very few of them. There are very few of them.
Can kind of communicate at a certain level in terms of what they're looking for in the design, but also how the kind of design service and projects that we can offer. And so I think, speaking in terms of sustaining our practice long term, it's really about finding clients that you can kind of see eye to eye with, and work well together. I
also think at least even I don't think we are really at a stage to say like we have figured it out. Like sure. we are definitely still in the process of I mean all the time we are also wondering like where is the next project gonna come. And actually, and I don't know whether this is obviously like we were quite fortunate also because of the pavilion. We attracted relatively more attention than we might not had the pavilion. But then at the same time, we found ourselves always facing the problem that like every client comes to you will not have like the dream project that you think of. But then at the same time, you need to pretty much treat every single opportunity as if they were your dream project. So, and a lot of the times, like it's probably like again naively, like a lot of the times maybe it's like wishful thinking, or like you're trying to do too much, or like you're like trying to really like even if they just give you like 50 square feet like to do a room, or like and you spend a lot of time coming up with like ideas that you think are worth pursuing, but I think you still have to be quite optimistic, when you are sort of venturing out on your own. It's impossible to not be optimistic if you wanna like keep on doing and practicing. So I think that really is something that we slowly find ourselves like you just have to, because every project has like a lot of obstruction and limitation in the beginning, but then you just have to really trust that you can make a difference no matter how small the project is.
I think this is a good time to ask a question from Nelson Chen. At this point in your career practice, what's a bigger challenge? Is it to generate new projects, or is it to execute them? Besides design competition, how do you attract new clients and project opportunities?
Yeah, I think both are great. Both
are super challenging.
Both are very challenging. Yeah. So you're constantly trying to balance the two, right? I wish I could ask the same question to Nelson, but yeah, both basically.
You can.
I guess we have been always constantly obviously trying to really work as hard as we can on every single project, trying to execute them as to the best we can. you know, and you are all constantly facing with regulation limitation and also budget limitation. So, you know, all those just constant battle. That's what one of the things that I mentioned, like, you know, the day-to-day is also overwhelming. Like sometimes, you know, you really could just dealing with those already takes up all your energy and effort, and then you have to go on and find more projects. And so where are then the resources and energy to think about, like, you know, your architectural pursuit? So, but, you know, I just think that, yeah, if you have enough passion and dedication, I think, you know, you find time and ways to kind of divert certain energy into things that you believed in. But yeah, I think again, I really hope we are not the only one here giving out finding clients advice, because we are definitely not the best ones. But so far we've been fortunate enough, like, you know, moving back to Hong Kong, and then we also were supported by organization of the Design Trust, and then the Hong Kong Design Center, like just kind of different organizations. I guess that maybe tells us that we would have to really reach out, like, to people, and, you know, get to know people and let people get to know you. And I think, yeah, step by step, hopefully, like, you know, you build connections, and yeah, maybe something could happen.
Yeah, I think, yeah, definitely being proactive is very key, especially when you're starting out. And even with a relatively small but hopefully solid portfolio, I think reaching out to who you think may not necessarily be potential clients, but just to share your work with members of the design community, or, you know, general public, other colleagues, I think is always a good way, not to think about it from the mindset of, let's say, getting projects, but generally just sharing work that you find exciting and discussing architecture.
Great. Maybe I'll follow up on a question about project management. There's a question from Kara Roberts. Thank you for the beautiful presentation. In the case of the West Kowloon Pavilion, did you work with one-to-one mockups while designing the modular system? So does the one-to-one come in, say, in the design phase, or probably before the construction? And in the context of first project, do you have any experience managing construction previously?
I think in the case of the pavilion, we looked at one-to-one parts of the cladding that we had looked at, just to test out whether the scale of it was right, different materials. There was a ceramic frit on them, so we tested out different densities of that, you know, quite a lot before the actual construction. And then, of course, lots of physical models at a smaller scale, but I think, yeah, most of it was more related to the cladding system in terms of mock-up. And prior to that, yeah, my personal experience is more limited to residential work in terms of construction. So it definitely there was a learning curve in terms of both familiarizing ourselves with building regulations in Hong Kong, and also just how things are built, because it's very different when you work in different locations, London, New York, Hong Kong, and they all approach construction and materials in a very different way. So I think, yes, both of us had some construction experience before, but I think moving back to Hong Kong and through the pavilion had to, yeah, learn on our feet quite quickly.
And I to add on the construction experience, I think, well, at least up until this point, we still feel like we don't have like, you know, the expertise. Like we don't dare to say we have already acquired the expertise of construction. I don't know if I hope, like, you know, in the near future we can have that confidence. But I think, like, one of the challenge and also the beauty of being sort of on your own is that you have to really figure things out on your own, and like either, you know, amongst your team and with the contractor that you work with. Like, so I don't think we know it all. Like even when we were building the pavilion, a lot of the things were like we kind of had the design idea, but how did we actually have to do it? Obviously, we try very hard to think or to almost pretend that we know. But of course, along the way, there were a lot of people, like such as we had help from front, a facade consultant firm, and also we had help from Bureau Happel, and also from this amazing engineer, Simon Picker, a former Arab engineer. Like all these people really came on board and helped us to went through the sort of design and construction process. So yeah, I think you would have to really try and collaborate and work with different talented and experienced people. And yeah, I think that's where the sort of magic happens.
Yeah, and I think, you know, if you feel you're lacking in either, you know, construction or project management and so on, it's definitely, I wouldn't say, it's of course daunting to, yeah, start your own practice if you feel you don't have enough experience. But as Paul mentioned, it's all about being proactive and reaching out to collaborators who have more experience, willing to take risks, and willing to really problem solve, even if you don't necessarily know upfront, yeah, what those issues are going to be.
Can you tell us a little bit about your working dynamics? Because both of you seem extremely optimistic and committed to the profession. I'm wondering, how does it work out in your practice? I mean, is one person reining the other person in, or yeah, tell us a bit about that.
I mean, I would say it's a lot of, there's not necessarily a clear divide in terms of division of work. We're both involved in every project in the office, and kind of brainstorming it with our team, and from the concept phase through to you know, detailed design construction. It's a lot of back and forth and discussion, yeah, between us and the rest of the office, I would say.
Yeah, but I think if you really had to kind of you know, point out the differences, I guess I'm the more sort of impatient one, and she's the more patient one. So you know, to really sort things out. But you know, I would say I'm the more sort of you know, try and push things forward when she is a little bit more like calm and stable and making sure everything is on the right track. So in a sense, I think that also helps us like to balance off. So like, you know, not just one person is like always like scrambling and like running around trying to like do the next thing, but then, you know, we also need to have the like the more sort of organized and calm and yeah, sort of, you know, less in a hurry sort of personality. So yeah, I think that would be, I think maybe the dynamic. But yeah, I think we mostly basically do everything together.
And was there someone, a mentor or a firm that you saw as a role model when you sought to sort of build this dynamic of this relationship?
Yeah, I mean, I'm really a architectural junkie. I really study pretty much not just like the firms that I work for, but also firms that, yeah, like I really admire or I despair. So I in a sense, yeah, I think you can really learn a lot by just observing other firms and how they work and, you know, what kind of approach that they take. So I think, yeah, in a sense, personally, I spend a lot of time really understanding how practices, like maybe on a superficial level, or at least on my own terms, like how I understand like different practices work. But of course, at the same time, I sort of, when we started the office, like we thought, oh yeah, maybe we can like this firm and, you know, we do things like that. but then very quickly you realize you can't, because like the circumstances, you know,
the type of projects you get, it's impossible to emulate another firm,
exactly,
no matter how efficient or you know,
so maybe like, for example, we really admire firms like OMA or like, you know, different Japanese architects, but obviously like, you know, the context is completely different in Hong Kong. I mean, we, you know, maybe you can aspire to like, you know, be more design oriented, but the way sort of practice will be radically different because of the different context. But like, aside from the sort of observing different firms, mentors definitely, you know, different teachers that we had from schools, and also people along our professional lives, our former employers, also in academic, like, you know, schools director, yeah, just, you know, people who really are passionate about architecture, you can always learn from. And I guess also, like, you know, you tend to stick with your own kind, and the more you are into it, you find yourself really surrounded by you know, even more passionate and dedicated people, and I guess that what push you forward.
We have a question from Marisa Yu. So you, seems like you are growing in size. Your office looks huge, looks much bigger than what you you know, your first office you showed us in the presentation. So are you growing in terms of the size of the office, and do you also expand the regions of work? Do you expand beyond Hong Kong? Do you work in, you know, the Greater Bay Area, in China or in Asia? And yeah.
Hi, Marisa. Yeah, well, we definitely have sort of try and at least have like a bigger space. Yeah, we because again, like Evelyn mentioned, we really enjoy having physical model as a part of the design process. So, you know, as you collect more materials and models, yeah, you find yourself, yeah. But in terms of the size of the office, I mean, we are still around about 8 people at the moment. So whether or not we will grow even bigger than this, I think in the short term, probably not. I think, you know, at the moment we are quite comfortable at this size, depending really on the amount of work that or commission that we will have. But again, this is where Evelyn and I comes in different. I'm always planning on maybe we need to hire a few more people. Like, you know, we don't have enough people to work on not only the commission, but also, like, you know, there might be potential competition or research project or just whatever. Like, maybe we need more people to work on stuff. And then Evelyn will be like, no, maybe, you know, slow down a little bit, and, you know, don't try to, you know, expand or scale too quickly, and, you know, be kind of patient and step by step. So yeah, I think that probably is a good thing. And then to answer about working in China.
Yeah, or regional work. I mean, we have done some projects in Vietnam, in Singapore, and some projects in China. And I do think we see Hong Kong as a good base for doing various projects in Southeast Asia and in China. Obviously, from last year, due to COVID, all of a sudden we've like kind of the extent of our kind of interaction has all of a sudden shrunk down to just Hong Kong. And so hopefully, you know, with the improvement of the pandemic, we're hoping to be able to at least explore different project opportunities beyond Hong Kong.
Great. I also actually have a question myself. I actually continue Winston's earlier comment on the sense of optimism. And it actually goes back to where you first met, right? You mentioned in the very beginning of the presentation, you said you first met in post-Olympic Beijing, right? And I was actually in Beijing at the time in 2009, 2010, and I was a student at Beida. And I remember there was a sense of optimism that's also beyond, financial or excitement or architectural, formal exuberance, is that there's a sense of optimism about, an open and connected world, right?
Yeah.
And that's 10 years or 12 years after Olympics now, like now where we are, that's now is also the name of the practice. Like, what do you think about where we are now? Like, when you practice now, how do you still carry on that sense of optimism in a world that's extremely divided?
Yeah, I think this is quite a complicated question. Yeah, I think because like you said, looking back, it's always easy to like categorize a certain time. And while you are doing like in that time, it might not even feel the same. So yeah, I think the post-Olympic China was definitely we really enjoyed that period of time because yeah, everything was booming in China and like everything was moving very quickly. But I think well, first, Hong Kong is quite different than like the whole context, quite different than somewhere like even maybe Beijing and like Chongqing and like different cities in China could be also very different. So I think like maybe moving back to like Hong Kong now, I think what we have discovered is obviously we won't be able to do an opera house or not even a house.
Yeah.
In that sense, but we realized there's like other opportunity for small practices in this current moment. We realized that developers, maybe not only Hong Kong, but definitely like we have been working on quite a few projects with Hong Kong developers that you maybe have like a bigger project. And they would have, let's say, build an office tower or hotel tower, and then they would maybe like kind of cut it up in many small pieces, and then give opportunities to younger, smaller practices, to have sort of an involvement in those bigger projects. So I think we realize that could be at least a way at the moment for small practice like ourselves to build up portfolio and maybe build up connection. For example, like the K11 project is kind of a good example where you can see there are a lot of different designers, and not all of them are like you have obviously the big firm like Honolulu or KPF, but then there are also a lot of like smaller boutique firms doing different interesting parts like soils, the Zhou Dai Folk Museum, gallery, facade. Like I think that is a very good example to show. Maybe yes, like you are a part of a bigger project, but if you sort of have enough ideas, maybe you can still stand out, but still at the same time like but it's a whole different test, because you have to also be coherent with the rest. You can't be like different from everything else. So I think that was another set of challenge that we face in Hong Kong today.
How about teaching and practice? Do you consider teaching as something productive or meaningful for your design practice?
Yeah, definitely. I think, well, one of the things we always talk about for teaching is that, first of all, it's engaging with students who always have, they're learning about architecture in a different context, and so they're coming up with lots of new ideas, and so it's being engaged with a younger generation who are looking at architecture in a different time, and I think that's always very refreshing for us as a practice. And I think the second thing is being able to clarify or articulate certain ideas about how we define architecture to students, and that always, forces us in a certain way to reflect on, okay, so what do we think architecture is, or how do we define it, how do we approach it, and I think in communicating that in an academic environment to students, that always helps us, or kind of forces us to reflect on how we practice, and whether there are certain parallels between teaching and practice. What can we learn from academia and bringing it into practice, and vice versa. So I think that's always a very good thing to explore in parallel. I think the academic environment.
Mm-hmm. And how about, there's actually a second part in Marissa's question I didn't mention. How about the current COVID-19 has impacted your work in terms of your belief in craft or the digital tools that you're using?
Well, I think like everyone else, definitely COVID-19 has quite a large impact, but at the same time, I think we are in such a slow profession, like being in architecture or interior design, construction in general are just so slow that like sometimes we're also almost a little bit immune from like the brutality of like the pandemic, like because things are for example some slightly bigger projects that we are doing will take like at least 2-3 years to be realized. So those projects are not so much affected by the COVID in general, but yeah, maybe sometimes government approval will take longer time, but generally things are still moving. And I think maybe also like last year was a little bit more, a lot more quieter than say previous times. Even we never really had a lot of clients knocking on our doors, but last year was obviously less sort of even getting to know us or like getting portfolio, but we see that maybe like just it's only like 2-3 of 2021. We see there are a lot more activities happening. Not so much like we have already gotten a lot more commission, but at least like people are talking and things are happening. I think people are a little bit already gotten used to the new norm, and and somehow you still have to move forward. And the craft and the digital question, I think that has always been something that we also been very sort of conscious on, because like you maybe saw in the presentation that at least myself, my training has been very digital really, and even early of my career. Like, so the craft part is almost like something that is like something that I acquire as I get more experience. So like unlike a lot of people where they are maybe mostly craft based at the beginning, like you draw by hand, you make physical model, and then you slowly like graduate to use computer. Like my whole education was like computer, and I hardly make any models, but then I think along the way, like you found beauties in actually making things of your own hands, and and also just understanding. I think construction also helps us understand how you actually put things together. It's not so easy like in the computer you lost or multiply array of certain things and that's it. So I think the craft part is still something that we want to invest a lot more in.
I think we maybe have time for 2 more questions. I have one I've been meaning to ask, so I'll ask that, but this is the last chance to input questions before we close for the night. So Paul and Evelyn, thank you for this wonderful presentation. I think it's very clear how we can track your interests and your vocabularies from then and how you apply them to projects from now. Can you maybe give us a glimpse into any new obsessions or where you think your practice will go from this point, especially in the context of COVID, or even, has this period of, looking even more intensely in Hong Kong changed how you think about your trajectory?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. I think definitely we would still very much like to, because let's say in Hong Kong, like you kind of really rely on a lot of interior works. It almost is like impossible to like do architecture really, like because they are like the lands are so valuable, and also they're so crowded and so much also voices. So it's actually very, very difficult for firms, small firms, to be able to work on like standalone buildings. So I think and of course like on the daily practice, we enjoy also working on a lot of interiors, because that is like a whole other level of scale that you have to deal with. And while we are still, working on interior projects, but I think hopefully we will be able to get more opportunities to again build even from smaller structures, to maybe be able to do a little bit more public work that not only serves the individual or the private, but in the more public realms. So I think hopefully that will sort of be our eventual destination, is to be able to do public works, hopefully that can serve more people and reach more people as well.
Do you see, I mean, are you working on more projects like the Middleman series after that?
You know what? We have always been thinking about making the Middleman into another format, like a book or I don't know, maybe an exhibition. So we've been thinking about that. But I guess that's kind of like one of the previous questions, is like how much time can you devote in research and the commission works. But we definitely would like to also extend the Middleman series. But at the same time, we also been lucky enough to do like different installations. So maybe through installations, we are also at the same time exploring different ideas. So recently we did like a small installation at the Detour, which is titled Brief Encounters, which is like a series of petition basically that helps people still be able to engage in public space. So things like that, we sort of, instead of like through initiative or like through videos, like there might be other means that we still implement research and explore new ideas.
Maybe one question, maybe before we close, because I know we have many students and we have also young graduates from architecture schools in the audience, and I actually see some names. I know them. They're not only in Hong Kong, but we see people from logging in from Shanghai and Beijing, other parts of the world, and Japan as well. As emerging architects, do you have any words of advice for students in architecture schools, or fresh graduates, or young architects and designers?
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe one of the key things is really to keep nurturing your enthusiasm for the practice, to be really open-minded in terms of how to approach architecture. I think both for myself and Paul, having been exposed to different kinds of firms, you know, the entire architecture field will go through different periods of trends. The one thing that you might think is, oh, really defines a certain way of doing architecture might be completely different in, you know, 5 or 10 years. So I would say, yeah, for students to be open-minded about different ways of practicing architecture, what defines architecture, and then to keep up the level of enthusiasm.
Yeah,
you're gonna need it.
yeah, I think totally. It's probably one of the most important thing, because it's not a very forgiving profession. You know, you have to work long hours. You know, like some of our colleagues are still working, and you know, I mean, you make a living, but you know, it's not like a get rich profession. So without passion and enthusiasm, it's really hard for you to. I mean, but you know, at the same time, I also know a lot of architects, like, you know, they sort of have like their other passions in life, and then, you know, treat architecture, or, you know, generally you know, as work. So, but you know, I guess, like, you know, if you're still here at about like 9:15 p.m. listening to us, you probably have a lot of enthusiasm about architecture. So yeah, I don't worry about the crowd here, but yeah, definitely, you know, it's something that you need to spend a lot of energy and effort on, and but I would say it's worthwhile.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Evelyn. Thank you, Paul. And thank you, Winston, for your time tonight. And it's great.
Thanks very much.
We will have more conversations like this coming this year with AIA Hong Kong, and we hope like our audience can continue to support us and join our conversations. So I think that's it for tonight. Thank you again. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.